Today's shoot is all about personal branding, and I'm going to give you some tips and tricks to make the most out of your studio, even when it's a small space. Hey everybody, Lindsay Adler here. Headshots and personal branding, they are the bread and butter for so many photographers. And if you shoot headshots, you can do it pretty much anywhere. You only need a tiny space. But with personal branding, you need to get a little bit more diversity in your shots, close-ups and mid-length and full-length shots, and getting it a little bit of movement. And so shooting in a tight space can be a little bit more challenging. So today I want to help you out. I want to give you some insights in how I make a small space work for personal branding, but still make them look high-end and polished. So for example, the studio behind me, this is just an extra room in my studio, and it's not tiny, but it's also definitely not big. It's about 9-ish feet wide, about 14 feet deep. So I got to figure out how to work around this small space to still get images that look high end. Now I do so in a variety of ways. I'm going to control my light with grids. We're going to choose softer quality of lights to reduce shadows. And then I'm also going to use multiple lights in order to create depth. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Let's talk a little bit about personal branding. When someone hires me for a personal branding shoot, the idea is that I want to represent them. Usually the images are going to be used for their marketing, their emails, their website, their social media. And I don't really want it to be totally generic. I want to bring a little bit of their personality into each frame. And so with Yumi here, she's an artist, she's a dancer, and of course she's got that bright pink hair. And so what I wanted to do is reinforce that with the colors in the frame through both her clothing and the background. The background that we've chosen is a Savage Universal Coral. And so we're going to have a nice tone-on-tone, hue-on-hue image. Now let's talk a little bit about lighting. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to build in one by one and give you an idea of why I've made my lighting selection. So let's begin by turning off all the lights and starting with just our main light to the left-hand side of the frame. Our main light is a 3-foot octabox. And the first reason this is so important is when you're shooting in a smaller space, you want to choose slightly smaller modifiers. A lot of times if I'm in a bigger space and I want softer light, I'll go with a 4-foot octa, a 5-foot octa, a large umbrella with diffusion. But if I went with those larger modifiers, they wouldn't be able to fit. It would get in my frame, and if my ceilings weren't tall enough, I wouldn't even be able to raise my light up. So by picking a 3-foot octabox, I'm choosing something that's still soft and will fit in my space, but the key is I want to bring it a little bit closer to my subject. The closer the light is to the subject, the softer the light is going to be. So the first thing is choosing the size of your modifier to fit in a small space. But then there's one other consideration. If you're only using one light, it's okay for that light to go everywhere in the frame. But I like to create a little depth and I like to have a little bit more control. So for my main light, something that's really important is that I've added a grid. What a grid does is it controls the spill and spread of light. So now, instead of the light bouncing everywhere, it's going to be a little bit more concentrated. It's going to focus a little bit more on my subject and less of it will hit the background. So then I can have a main light, a fill light, a rim light, each one giving me a little bit of depth. So let's take a look at what our 3-foot octabox with a grid is contributing to this shot. All right, so you'll see that what the grid has done is it's made the environment a lot darker because it's controlled that spill of light. If I took the grid off, it's going to bounce around the walls and the ceiling and everything will get lighter. It's not right or wrong, but I'd rather have a little bit more depth, a little bit more control. Now, something else that you'll notice is that by adding the grid, I'm not seeing quite as much shadow on the background because I can control that little pocket of light. That brings me to another thing. You will see a little bit of a shadow on the right-hand side of the frame, but because I've chosen a soft quality of light, it's not a very distracting shadow. It's pretty subtle. If I went with a harder modifier, for example, if I chose a bare bulb or maybe even a beauty dish, chances are that shadow would be a little bit more defined and a little bit more distracting. So in a small space, if I can't move my light around to move that shadow, it's going to be a problem. So my recommendation is use a soft light, but use a smaller light, bring it closer, and add a grid for control. All right, so let's say for this shot, I really did want to represent Yumi's personality, and she's fun and upbeat. And I like this image, but I think it's a little too low-key. It's a little too dark. So that's where I'm going to add my fill light. Now, if I've got a lot of space, I have a ton of choices over fill light. I could use a 5-foot octabox and a large umbrella with diffusion. Basically, I just want a big soft light source so that it doesn't cast a shadow on the background, just like we talked about. I can't fit a big soft light source in this space. I'm working in a small space, so I have to work with it. So the solution in this case is I'm going to bounce the light. So over here to the right-hand side of the frame, I've got a bare bulb and I'm kind of just bouncing it up into the corner of the wall or the ceiling. I could even close this door a little bit and give my light a little bit bigger surface to bounce off of. But what it's doing is the light is small, but it's bouncing against the wall and ceiling, which then spreads out. And so it makes it a large, soft, bounced light source. Then I can dial it up and down to control how dark or light the shadows appear. So let's add our second light, our fill light, into this personal branding image. All right, so this is giving me a lot more of the feel that I wanted for her personal branding images. But you'll notice it didn't really create much of a shadow on the background because since the light can bounce, it spreads out and it's soft, softer light source is less defined shadow edges. And so it's giving me that brighter feeling and the fill that I want without having to try to figure out how to fit a modifier in there. So I think this could work no problem with just 2 lights. But if you want to create a little bit more depth, then maybe a 3rd light would be appropriate. I could add a hair light or a rim light or a background light, but the key is how much space are you actually working with? Do you have room to add these lights? So I've got another little pro tip. We have added a rim light in this case, but in order to get it to fit in the scene, we're using a stand that can compact, that can fit in a corner without hanging over my background. Today we're using something called the mag stand. This is a new light stand that I love because it's got these notches which make it really easy to control. It's lightweight, but also it can compact so it can fit in small corners. So that's what we have our rim light on. And our rim light, we're using a 1x4 foot strip softbox. But there's an important thing about this light. On it, there is, once again, a grid because grids control the spill of light. If I've got that strip softbox there without a grid, what happens is the light spreads out. It's going to spill on the background and create weird highlights and shadows, or it's going to bounce off the other wall and then it's going to fill in more than I want. So the grid is what gives me control. So the 2 additional tips for this final light is get a stand that can compact and use a grid to control that light. So let's add our 3rd light, which is going to give us a little more separation, a little depth, and it's going to give us a little bit more polish. All right, so you see that highlight on the side of her hair and the side of her body? That is what the rim light does. It gives us a little bit more polish and separation. But you'll notice the background, it's pretty much the same as the previous shot because I have a grid on that rim light. If I didn't have a grid, I wouldn't have the same control and it'd probably have weird highlights and shadows. So with this, I think the light looks beautiful, but there's one more consideration we haven't talked about when shooting in a small space, and it has nothing to do with light. It has to do with depth. So I mentioned we have about 9 feet of width, about 14 feet of depth, but that's if I'm in the room. If you're shooting in a small space, if you can, back up and zoom in. It's going to help you out. So for example, if you're shooting in like an office or a bedroom, but there's a hallway and you can back out into the hallway, and then zoom in, it's going to help you. Because if you're close to your subject and you shoot a wider focal length, chances are like the top of their head starts to run into the top of the background and it becomes a hassle. When you back up and zoom in, you're actually compressing the subject and narrowing the field of view. You'll just get better results. It is not essential, but it definitely will be helpful. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get some personal branding shots of Yumi, and I'm going to get close-ups and mid-lengths and full-length shots and try to get a little bit of movement. I'll shoot some where I'm in that 14-foot depth, but I'll do others where I back up and zoom in to give myself a little bit more flexibility. All right, so with that, let's get the shot. When you look at these personal branding photos of Yumi, I don't think you can tell that they were shot in a small studio space. But that's because I knew how to work with this space. So let me just summarize one more time some of the key takeaways of how to make a small space work for you. First and foremost, try to use soft light. It's going to help you not have distracting shadows on the background. But when you choose your modifier, it can't be too big because it still needs to fit in the space, which is why in this instance, I chose a 3-foot octabox. But then you do want to have control over your light. So consider adding grids. Grids control the spill so that you don't have unwanted bounce on the walls around or highlights and shadows on the background. Next, for your fill light, if you can't fit another light, another modifier, take your light and bounce it into a corner of the room. It becomes a big soft light source that won't create distracting shadows, and it doesn't have a big footprint. And then, last but not least, speaking of footprint, consider getting a stand or two that can be a little bit more compact so they can fit in tight edges and not get in your frame. Those are all things that are going to help you be more successful when shooting personal branding in a small space, but not making it look like a small space. So if you want to see the gear that I use to make these beautiful images of my subject, be sure to check out the links in the description below. And by the way, I have many tutorials about personal branding and headshots and money-making photography, and I've linked to them as well. And if you pick up the gear that you see here, I recommend you visit Adorama.com. See you next time, guys.